Sony, Sony, Sony. So many people forget that you make a lot of terrible decisions, a lot of terrible choices. This is usually overlooked in the modern era simply because you've got the most sales and you've got the most games for a console, especially with the whole exclusive and single player focused game going on. But anyway, that's beside the point. What's going on, everybody? It is Q from Retro Q Gaming, as always, and I want to talk about something that Sony is doing very, very wrong, very, very poorly, and altogether completely fucked up. Now, I will say, take this with a tiny bit of a grain of salt, simply because this is technically pre-release, and I don't expect it to be fixed, to be honest. I expect this to be representative of the final product, but I just want to put it out there just for clarity's sake, if you will. So, what am I talking about? Well, the PlayStation Classic. We all know that coming off the back of the highly successful NES Classic and SNES Classic, both from Nintendo, two fantastic pieces of hardware, all done so well, so right. So many good games, great choices of games, and brand new custom developed emulators on these pieces of hardware to do what they want to do. So Sony, being Sony, piggybacking off the success of all this, earlier in the year announced the PlayStation Classic, which was going to be a mini PlayStation, just like the NES was a mini NES and the SNES was a mini SNES. And it was going to have 20 games, what they classified as genre and era-defining games, or platform-defining games, whatever way you want to look at it and describe it. And they were going to ship this out for €100 or $100. And it's going to have these 20 games, two basic digital original controllers, no analog sticks, no DualShock controllers, no anything, meaning no Ape Escape. And overall, this sounded like a really good prospect. Granted, a couple of us were a little bit unhappy about certain things, like the omission of the DualShock or the analog sticks, as well as the price versus what you were getting on it. But many of us, myself included, decided to not so much err on the side of caution, but we just decided we'll roll with it just because with what the product actually is and what it represented, much like the NES and SNES classics, we were willing to forgive them and forego them that little bit extra. But then the cracks and the chinks in the armor started appearing. First up was the game list. Now, I went over the game list a little while back. Overall, 20 games, varies on the region. North America and Europe have the same 20 games versus Japan, which has a different 20, or at least some of the 20 games are different in their region. But overall, some of the games were very puzzling put on there. Some of them were understandable, even if they weren't my cup of tea, and some of them I absolutely 100% agreed with. Like, say, for example, Final Fantasy VII and Metal Gear Solid. But there were definitely some questionable games on that list, as well as some weird, super extravagant choices in the wrong ways. Some surprises, essentially. But overall, when you look at the amount of games included on that system, or at least on that list, it was a far weaker selection than was put on, say, the NES Classic or the SNES Classic, especially when you consider how many games the PS1 actually had, how many of them were so high quality and well regarded. Yet it feels like we only got a handful of those games, as well as a bunch of other random ones. Anyway, I'm harping on about the game selection too long here. I will say this, originally I was a little bit less disappointed with the game list, but as time has gone by, it's kind of hit me a bit more, and I am progressively getting a little bit more unhappy with the game list. But now it gets worse. So over the last couple of days, in fact all this week, some members of the press and the gaming media and quote, games journalists 2018, am I right? Haha! Topical. Got their hands on these units. And overall, the reports back are not very good. Now, I will say this, as many of you probably already know, but some of you may have stumbled onto this video some other way. I, of course, am not representative of the average consumer. I like to demand higher quality, I like to demand better, and I'm not saying that your average person won't demand better or whatever, but they will accept a lower quality as a standard, if you will. I'm not like that. I prefer some high quality stuff. I will pay more for it, and I will expect better and demand better from companies. So again, I realize I'm not the target market for this product, but still, it's just throwing it out there that I understand where some of this stuff comes from. But overall, I feel like this product and what we've learned from it over the last couple of days is extremely lazy, slapdash, and overall a quick cash grab. So what am I talking about anyway? Well, first off, we'll start with the physical side of it, the actual tangible product, if you will. Overall, it looks like a mini PS1 or a mini original PlayStation rather than a PS1. That's the little baby looking rounded thing, or the redesign of later. But it looks and feels like a smaller version of an original PlayStation, which is what everyone wants, which is what we expected, which is what we know and love. Can't really fault anything there. What we can fault is what's inside it, as well as the connections for it. So let's look at the controllers first. The two controllers that are included, the standard original base digital only day one controllers with no analog sticks or DualShock features or anything, are just generic USB connection controllers. Now Sony have officially said that these controllers cannot work properly on any other platform like PC, PS Vita TV, or PS3 or 4. They're really only designed to work with this system. Of course, they will eventually somehow be made working on PC because that's what we do here. But the fact that they have a USB connection on there, they have also come out and said that no other controllers can work on that system, on the PlayStation Classic, which is kind of weird when you think about it. If it's just a standard generic USB controller with nothing special, literally just all digital buttons, no analog sticks, digital face buttons, D-pad, and no proper triggers, or at least analog triggers. And it gets even weirder now in a second. Because when you look at what's inside this actual unit powering the whole system, it's not a little weird custom piece of hardware like the NES Classic and the SNES Classic have. The reports of people who have taken this apart and looked at it have said that what is in the PlayStation Classic is just a 100% standard, generic, off-the-shelf Raspberry Pi. For those of you who aren't familiar with what that is, a Raspberry Pi is just a very basic little small computer that you can do a lot with. Obviously it's really small, it can fit into that tiny shell. It's not exceptionally powerful, but running PlayStation 1 games isn't anything crazy. But this is worrying for a few reasons, which are extrapolated now in a second. The fact that it's using just a small Raspberry Pi, an actual little mini basic PC, but can only, allegedly at least anyway, use these special exclusive PlayStation controllers and nothing else, that's kind of weird. I think personally that maybe other controllers will work with this, Sony are just saying that they won't officially. Or because it's just a generic Raspberry Pi, some people will modify and hack this into the ground to be able to use whatever controllers you want on there. But the fact that they're doing it in such a very basic and cheap way is kind of almost astounding, really. You would have thought that with Sony celebrating the anniversary of the original PlayStation using this little system, they would have put a bit more effort into it. And speaking of putting some effort into it, that's where we'll move on to some of the software in here. Now, the emulator running this is not custom developed. It is not specific. It is not anything. The emulator that Sony are using, as is in the actual licensing user notes in the system, is just PCSX. That is a very, very bog standard emulator on PC. They have licensed to be able to use that on this little system. And this is one of the biggest and most baffling choices in the entire system. Allegedly, Sony was producing this whole thing in-house, which it no longer seems to be the case. It just seems like they've licensed it out to some other company. Hell, for all we know, it could be AtGame. It's being done so poorly at this rate. And they have just licensed a basic PlayStation PC emulator. I say this because when you look at it, it's a Raspberry Pi, it's a mini PC, there's no doubt about it, it would make sense that it could run on there. But here's where it gets a little bit dicey. Sony already have various PS1 emulators running in-house. They have the PS1 emulator that runs on the PSP, they have the one that runs on the Vita, and they even have the one that works on the PlayStation 3. Many of these are high quality and very well received and praised in comparison to what they're actually using on here. And that just feels really, really weird in some aspects. But it doesn't stop there. Apparently, because of the nature of the emulator that they're using, the game emulation is a little bit off. There's a little bit buggy, a little bit glitchy. It's not perfect, but apparently it's not game breaking. But if you're familiar with any of these games outside of playing them once, maybe 20 years ago, apparently the issues, bugs, glitches, etc. will be noticeable. But it gets worse. Apparently a lot of the emulation style and all as well, like say the menus, etc. that they use, is extremely basic and extremely bare bones. When you boot up the NES Mini, you really do get a feel like it's the whole 8-bit era and 8-bit design, in both audio and visual. It's the same with the SNES Classic, 16-bit audio, visual, design. But the PlayStation Classic is just very, very basic and bare bones by comparison. It's essentially just a blank screen with a carousel of games. Oh, and speaking of games, we haven't even got to what's wrong with those yet. But before we get to the games and what the problem is there, let's look at the options on this, or rather the lack of options. When you had the NES Mini and the SNES Mini, it had various different display options, different borders, different ways to display the game, such as 4:3 or pixel perfect or scan lines. There seems to be no options whatsoever in the PlayStation Mini. It will just output them at 720p with no types of visual enhancements or ability to change the display or customize it in any way, shape or form. It seems to not even put them through a proper scaler. It seems to just output the low resolution PS1 and just stretch it out to your quality settings. I believe it's 720p. And if you're familiar with some of the early 3D polygon style games, that can result in a very, very rough picture. And now we're going to move on to the games, because the games have one of the possibly most egregious offenses going. There are theories out there at the moment because of the nature of the whole product and how all over the place it is, as well as what we're going to talk about in this game section as well. That the rumors and conspiracy theorists believe that whatever company was behind this, because it certainly damn well seems like it's not Sony, was given a list of 20 games, and it seems they possibly just went out and downloaded 20 ISOs from the internet and called it a day. The first ones they found, they didn't seem to make sure anything was proper or anything was perfect. The reason for that is some of these games, and there seems to be no rhyme or reason or anything behind it, some of them are the North American versions of the game. Some of them are European versions of the game. Now you may be wondering what the difference is. Well, first off, one or two games have some slight differences. It's usually nothing major, with the exception of maybe Resident Evil Director's Cut. Let's hope that the European version on there and not the American one, simply because of that god-awful soundtrack of the American version. But other than that, you usually don't have many issues. There might be one or two things changed in regards to maybe a design or a logo or a bit of dialogue or something small. But there is one huge flaw in this process. And that flaw is that every single one of these European PAL versions of these games that's on this system is running at 50 Hz. Not 60 Hz, but it's running at 50 Hz. This might not be a big deal for some of you Americans out there because you might not have had to worry about all that back in the day. But here in Europe, we were fighting for 60 Hz ever since the Super Nintendo days, when we were stuck at 50, because we wanted that better frame rate the entire time. Many people will have you believe it's only more recent that frame rates have been an issue, but growing up in Europe, I can tell you that is absolutely not the case. So the big deal there is that these games are going to run slower. They're going to look and feel slower, and yes, even the sound and the music will play slower. There are legendary comparisons out there of Sonic the Hedgehog running at 60 Hz versus running at 50 Hz. If you grew up in America or a region with 60 Hz, and then you hear the other one, you will think this sounds off. Just like for the longest time when everything was finally converting over to 60 Hz and all that over here. For the first while, games running in 60 Hz that I'd already played at 50 sounded a bit different, played a little bit different, and even looked that little bit different. And there seems to be no rhyme or reason whatsoever with this whole 50 to 60 Hz, these European and American versions. They just seem to be completely random with no logic behind it at all. This whole thing sounds like a disaster waiting to happen for any type of informed consumer. I say informed consumer because, like I said, I know I'm not the specific target market for this. Yes, I did grow up playing the PS1. I got my PS1 about 6 or 7 months after it first launched. I didn't get it that Christmas. I got it in maybe January, February after it got restocked. But the PlayStation Classic is designed for the people out there who maybe haven't played a game since the PS1. It's marketed at the people who will walk into a shop, maybe with their son or whatever, or their daughter, and see it on a shelf and think, oh, there's the PlayStation 1, that looks cool, it's a little thing I can hook up and play some of these games that I recognize. And then they buy it, maybe not for €100, but it's the idea, and go from there. But anyway, that's beside the point. Overall, this system seems really, really, really mishandled and poorly managed. I still to this day believe that Sony probably have actually outsourced this because it seems like an absolute disaster. Granted, Sony have made some extremely poor decisions as it is, so it even could be them. But some of this just absolutely blows my mind. And like many other people, it blows my mind to the point where I don't know if I even want this product anymore, especially because it's €100. I'm legitimately thinking of cancelling my pre-order but at the same time, I may keep it just because of the collectability of it. Granted, I still would play it a little bit now and again, but as it stands at the moment, it's a real 50-50. I still have about a month to think about it, so we'll see how it goes in the meantime. Anyway, let me know in the comments section below, what are your whole thoughts and opinions on the whole situation regarding this? From anything from hardware to software to emulation to different versions of games, be it European or American, open source emulators, as opposed to their already very high quality internally developed stuff that they actually have, and anything to do with this system whatsoever, as well as will you be picking this up, or has all this information that's come to light in the last couple of days changed your decision on anything to do with it? Let me know all that good stuff in the comments section below. Hit the appropriate button to let me know how I did on the video. While you're at it, why not head on over and hit that subscribe button and even ring the little notification bell. Granted, getting a notification from YouTube in current year about a new video upload or a live stream is a whole other story. But hey, at least you could say you tried, am I right? As always, thank you so much for watching. I will see you in the rest of the videos in my channel.